Hey friend, welcome back to another tutorial video. We're going to be talking all about wet and dry painting today in today's tutorial. If you missed it, we already posted a wet and wet painting tutorial, so make sure you check that one out. This is the second or another big painting foundation or technique within watercolor. And wet and dry, it's basically essentially exactly how it sounds. You're layering with watercolor using wet and dry. And so with watercolor, you're working with a really wet medium. And so if you want to show any sort of detail or layers, etc., you need to wait for your watercolor to completely dry and then layer on top of it with darker pigment. And so if you're wanting for more soft, diffused mixing of colors or blending, then that is wet and wet because you're working with two wet pigments or water. But with wet and dry, you're layering on top of dry layers with wet pigment and then waiting for it to dry and then wet pigment on top. So if you want to get into more realistic style painting, this is a great foundational technique to learn before you move on there. But then also you can even use them with loose style paintings as well. So let's get started. All right, so this is gonna be pretty straightforward, pretty quick and easy, but it's an amazing technique to practice and to take note of as you're painting florals, landscapes, whatever it is you're painting, so that you can continue to develop that muscle memory and train your eye for wet and dry, and when it's appropriate to use wet and wet or when it's appropriate to use wet and dry. So wet and dry, like I said, it's exactly how it sounds. So we're gonna start with, I'm using my size 16 round brush, and I'm just going to grab some Prussian blue and lay down a rectangle or a swatch of Prussian blue. And I want it to be lighter, so I'm going to just grab a little bit of Prussian blue and a lot of water on my brush. And then I'm going to release the excess water and pigment on the edge of my water cup so I don't lay a puddle down on my paper. It's just a thin, wet layer of water and pigment. So essentially, if you're painting anything, whether it's floral, landscape, etc., you would wait for your base layer to dry. And how to know if it's completely dry or not is you won't see any of this glisten or sheen. So I've just laid down a layer of just a little bit of Prussian blue and some water, kind of looks like a sky. And I am going to wait for this to dry. But I'm also going to show you how we can do it, how we can use wet and dry on something like a leaf. So I'm going to grab some sap green, and I'm going to lay down a lighter yellow-green leaf stroke. So if you don't know how to paint leaves, you can check out my video on leaves. I did a whole series. So I'm just going to paint a leaf. And then once this dries, I'll show you what I would do using wet and dry to give it some more detail. So here's a couple samples from my book, Everyday Watercolor. If you don't have it, check it out. We'll link it below. But this is a tutorial we cover in the book, and you can see some details in this bird of paradise, like on these petals right here, where the lightest layer is the base layer. I waited for that to dry. It's like a light yellow orange. And then I used some wet and wet for this darker orange right here, because you can see that kind of burst or smooth blend between the yellow orange and the darker orange. But then this reddish orange, I went over with my size 2 brush and gave it these veiny details or these creases within the petals and the mouth of this flower right here. And then any of these shadows, like on this green part where it's overlapping the neck of this flower, I wanted to enunciate that this was in shadow or it was darker. And so that dark green there and then dark green here, I used wet and dry to enunciate this inside or the darker part of the green part of the flower. And then this is another piece from my book, Everyday Watercolor. But basically my base layer was this vein color, this light yellow-green. And I waited for that to dry. And then with each little leaflet or piece of this monstera leaf, I used wet and dry to layer on top of it to darken the areas and to make them more pronounced, and so that the vein area is the lightest part. And then same thing here, more wet on dry to show that this part of the leaf is behind this front flipped up leaf. And then for this piece, this is a loose style floral piece. I used wet and dry to create the stamen in the center of these anemone flowers. If I were to add this black, the center of these flowers, while the red petals were still wet, it would just become gray, red, everything. So waiting until these petals dry is really important to make sure that the stamen and the pollen and the center of the flower stays really enunciated and doesn't become blurry. And then this is a piece from my newest book, Everyday Watercolor Flowers. The veins and the details in all of these leaves, I waited for the area of the leaf to completely dry, the layer underneath. And then with my size 2 brush, I went over it once it was dry with these darker vein details. And then same thing with the shadows on these stems and the details on the petals, etc. are all done wet and dry. Okay, so this little guy here, I guess we can call it a sky, a little swatch of sky. It kind of looks like a sky to me and even has a little hint of wispy clouds. And so if I wanted to, if I was painting a landscape, I could enunciate where the wet and wet added some natural looking clouds. I could enunciate that by grabbing a slightly darker Prussian blue. I'm gonna grab a smaller brush, so I have a size 6. Slightly darker Prussian blue so that I can enunciate the bottom of these clouds. Maybe even a little bit lighter. But as you can see, if this was wet underneath, it would just blur and become one big blob. But because it's dry, I get these crispy edges, so it's a really defined shadow. You can also, now we're getting weird, but you get the point. You can also paint in some birdies. But with wet and dry, you can layer on top without worrying about messing up any sort of distinct shape or lines or shadows. Still waiting for this leaf to dry. Okay, so this leaf is still a teensy bit wet, but I'm going to show you on the area that it's still, or that it is dry, how you can use wet and dry. We're going to have a ton of future tutorials using both wet and wet on dry techniques so you can see it in action. But for now, this will get you started with the techniques so you can kind of see how it works. So I can grab a darker color. So I've got some sap green and a touch of black on my brush to darken the green color. So it's slightly darker than the base green that I have on this leaf. And I'm just gonna pull out a little vein, let's say. Or I can darken this whole right side of this leaf if I wanted to. And now we have a two-tone leaf. Or you can show vein details by just having these little veins like that. So wet and dry is super crucial for adding any detail. This is obviously quickly done and it's not anything spectacular, but this is how wet and dry works. And so in future tutorials, I'm gonna go into detail using both wet and dry so you can see how they work together and when I would use which technique and so on. So I hope you have fun practicing your wet and dry, and until next time, I'll see you in the next video.